Hello again, I'm Paula Gooder, talking with Rowan Williams about his recent book, Discovering Christianity. This time, we're thinking about tradition. Rowan, in the previous session, we reflected on scripture, and in the next one, we're going to be thinking about reason. This one, we're thinking about tradition. Those three words come together, don't they? Do you want to tell us why scripture, tradition and reason, it becomes an important three-word phrase?
It's a connection that's made especially in my own Christian tradition as an Anglican, because I think in the 17th century, not long after the English Reformation, there was a lot of talk about how our theology, our thinking about God, should be using the Bible, the inherited traditions of reading and understanding the Bible, and also using our common sense. And that threefold pattern, or what some people call the three-legged stool, became, for many people in the Church of England, a useful sort of shorthand for talking about what we needed to feed into our Christian thinking. So I've used that in this context as, yes, a handhold for thinking about some of the guidelines we might have.
And so in that context, what does tradition mean?
As I said a moment ago, it's not something independent of the Bible. It's much more like the legacy of people who've read the Bible before us. Here and now, as we were saying in the last session, we read the Bible together. It's a community exercise. And that means that we are listening to other people reflecting on their reading of the Bible in the present, but also in the past. If I pick up St. John's Gospel, it helps me to be aware that this has been read by millions and millions of people before me, and it's been commented on by hundreds or thousands of people. And it's been incorporated into Christian worship in different ways. I pick up St. John's Gospel, I read the first few words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And I'm likely to be aware of the way that's used in Christmas services. You hear it at carol services. That's just one little example of how the Bible's been fed into the life of worship and the life of reflection. So tradition is primarily that awareness. I'm not reading on my own. I'm reading in company, and in the company of some of the really great figures of the past who have prayed and thought their way into the depths of this, not something independent of the Bible.
So let's have a think about some of those great figures. I know it's an impossible question, but if I said to you, which are the three that would stick out in your mind as being the most influential on shaping your faith and life, which ones would you go for?
In tradition, most widely, well, I'd have to start with St. Augustine. Living at the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th Christian century. And I start with Augustine, not least because he's one of those geniuses who covers a whole range of styles of writing. He writes a brilliant spiritual autobiography. He writes wonderful sermons and commentaries on the Bible. He writes works of philosophical and even political acumen. He writes abstract theology. He's somebody who's really shaped a huge amount of the Christian tradition. And it's not insignificant that he's not a European. He's a bishop in North Africa, probably from a partly indigenous North African family. And that's always worth remembering here. He's not, thinking back to something we were talking about in a couple of sessions back, he's not an insider. And that gives him a little bit of edge. So Augustine, yes. I'd probably say a bit later on that the hymns of Charles Wesley play a big role for me. Here's somebody who writes over 1,000 hymns, and that's how he does his theology. He's reflecting on biblical texts, reflecting on the experience of prayer and the reality of the community as it is. And he produces these astonishing, still vivid images for us to work with. The hymn called Come, O Thou Traveller Unknown, which uses the biblical story of the patriarch Jacob wrestling with the angel in the darkness. He uses that as an image for the Christian life. We wrestle in the darkness with a God we can't fully see or understand, but hang on to. So Wesley is a very important presence for me. And I think beyond that, it's quite hard to pin it down, but probably I'd go for one or two of the great 16th century writers on the life of prayer, St. Teresa or St. John of the Cross, because they're people who, although they're writing about prayer, are doing it in the context of writing about the Bible and how they're reading the Bible. And they're doing it with a very theological approach, which isn't in the least abstract or academic, but very much bound in with doctrinal patterns. So when I think of tradition, yes, it's people like that, people who make the biblical imagery come alive, who apply it to the patterns and the seasons of Christian living, who are clearly doing all this in the context of worship, adoration, prayer. That's tradition.
We need to get on to the slightly more uncomfortable bit now, which is these are the voices we listen to, and many of us would hold them up. There are also the voices we don't listen to, and those over the years which the Church has deliberately said, no, we're not going to listen to those. They come under the banner of heresy.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about heresy and how that challenges us.
Many years ago, I wrote a book on one of the great early Christian heretics in the 4th century. And I did so partly because I wanted to understand myself better and to explain a bit better how a heretic, somebody who's judged to be marginal to the main Christian flow of teaching, how a heretic can actually make a positive contribution by asking awkward questions, by saying, that doesn't make sense. And sometimes the heretic says, that doesn't make sense, I'll make sense of it for you. And the Church as a whole might say in response, you're quite right, that doesn't make sense, but we're not happy with your solution, which is pretty much what happened in this particular instance. So yes, there's a real importance in going back and retrieving the sort of conversations people were having. Why did the creed come to be as it is? What were the questions they were asking? What was people's sense of unfinished business? And the way I like to put this is, we need to look at Christian history as a series of stories about how people learned to talk the way they now talk about God. We don't just take these formulae out of midair. We learn, we think, we explore, we test out solutions. Some of them work, some of them don't. And that's how theology works. That's how orthodoxy, right doctrine, or right, as it can also mean, right glorifying, right praise. It's an ideal I believe in, absolutely, but it's not a timeless one. It's people feeling their way to this, and the voices that are suppressed or denied have their role in that, and we need to honour that. Just as also we need to be conscious, and I think this has to be behind your question too, conscious of those whose voices we will never hear.
Yeah, absolutely.
The ordinary person living in the 15th century, let's say, who was very much at the mercy of what people in authority would say in church and state. The people who incredibly discovered Christianity as liberating, even when they were being enslaved by others who called themselves Christians. All of that history should weigh heavily on us. But at the same time, that's life-giving tradition as well, because we think, in spite of all that Christian authorities did sometimes to stifle the revolutionary life of the gospel won. The gospel pushed through and became good news for people.
And you will expect me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. For me, one of the really interesting things is the voices we naturally hear because they are men, they are wealthy, they come from particular privilege. And for me, one of the glories of tradition is rooting out those voices you don't normally hear, listening for the voice of women or those who have been enslaved, and hearing more what they want to, what they can communicate to us about what we've missed in the gospel.
That's right, and that's one reason why tradition is really an aspect of the common life of the community across the centuries. We are inheritors of all that common life, and the Spirit is at work in the whole of it. So we would expect to be, as you say, rooting out bits of that legacy that need to be foregrounded in a new way. And that, to me, is the difference between being serious about tradition and being a traditionalist. The traditionalist says, well, it was all fine back then, and all we've got to do is keep the thing going. And that just short-circuits the whole process of actual learning in real, difficult, challenging settings, which is the story of the Christian community.
Rowan, thank you. We've been reflecting this time on tradition. We will turn our attention next time to reason and how reason is important in the formation of Christian tradition.